is Farron Franzak coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we are going to our guest, Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. Scott, welcome to the show. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yourself?
So far, so good.
Great to hear your voice, Scott. The voice of reason.
Voice of reason. Yeah, Scott, you've been quite accurate on this. And I guess we want to break this into two topics. One has to do with the Iraq War, of course. This is the 18th year anniversary. But I kind of want to start with just the military assessment of the issues on the ground. And we have been talking on the show, at the very least mainstream media has been talking as if the Russian military has stalled, that that they're just wantonly killing civilians, etc. And they're ignoring the fact that the West, or the East, is where much of this military conflict is taking place. And for that matter, much of the Ukrainian military is taking place. Mariupol is about to fall, or at the very least seems to be. So much so Russians basically demanded the surrender, to which they said no. Scott, from your assessment, is it proper, or does it make military sense to allow your military to basically be smashed in a city like this, as opposed to resigning, especially when the situation seems to be completely lost? What are your thoughts? And start that anywhere you want to, if you want to start it in a different place. But that's kind of where my mind was going to, as the city was basically teetering on the brink of collapse. And Zelensky was online or on air, basically trying to get people to join his World War III tour. What are your thoughts?
Well, let's start with some military basics. Most people, when they look at, when you examine a war of this scale, and a war of this scale hasn't been fought in Europe since World War II. We tend to look back at World War II as being wars of territorial acquisition. We started the Second Front in 1944 for the purpose of liberating France and then driving into Germany. The Soviets, at the same time period, were pushing the Germans out of the Soviet territory and then driving towards Berlin. So we're used to big arrows on a map that signify territorial acquisition. And it's very hard when your brain has been trained in this way to look at a map where territorial acquisition is secondary to the military purpose of the military event in question. When the Russians launched this invasion, I know there's political sensitivity to that word. It's an invasion. Of Ukraine. They made it clear from the start, we are not coming in as occupiers. We have two military objectives. The first is denazification. The second is demilitarization. So they are going to destroy the Nazis, and they are going to dismantle the Ukrainian military, which is a de facto NATO proxy. So understanding this, we need not look at the map and say, my God, they failed to conquer all of Ukraine, therefore their mission is a failure. We have to say, are they achieving denazification? And the answer is yes. You see, everybody talks about the Azov Battalion, and we'll get to that in a second because that features prominently in the battle for I think it's Mariupol.
Mariupol, that's it.
On the shore of the Sea of Azov. But there's other Nazi units. There's the Donbass Battalion. And when we say battalion, these actually were formed into regiments, and they have multiple battalions. There's other Nazi units fighting in the south near Odessa. There's units that were fighting opposite in Kharkiv. The Nazis are everywhere. And the Russians are finding these battalions, engaging these battalions, and destroying these battalions. And that's part and parcel of their overall denazification. They don't want to occupy Hill 863. They simply want to kill every Nazi on Hill 863, and then they don't care about Hill 863. And that's the reality of the map. The other thing they're doing is dismantling the Ukrainian military. And they do this by, first of all, the fact that the Ukrainians put most of their forces into eastern Ukraine. And so there is a huge battle of annihilation taking place right now that the West is only now beginning to wake up to. I'm starting to hear people on TV going, oh, yeah, and there's this potential pincer movement that could cut off all of the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine. Yeah, that's sort of what the Russians have been trying to do since day one.
Well, it's so funny, Scott, because like this morning, for example, on CNN, I always say I have CNN in one room in my living room, Fox in my bedroom, and I kind of go back and forth, find the truth somewhere in the middle, although there's not a lot of truth going around lately on the mainstream media. But this morning you have CNN where they're like, yeah, these Ukrainians, they took back a neighborhood in Kiev. And it's like, okay. But then you have Colonel McGregor the other night on Tucker saying the war's over. Like Russia's getting everything, like this is going to be done pretty soon, maybe a week or two left. And, Tucker was like, really? Really? But you have McGregor, though, who I feel like has been pretty truthful. And you and him have been aligned on a lot of the same stuff. And you guys have been saying the same stuff. And obviously, we know McGregor has been kind of pushed aside ever since his one appearance about talking about Zelensky being, not necessarily he didn't say a thug, but saying that he's wrong. I mean, is this kind of the beginning of the end as far as this war?
Yeah, again, we have to start by recognizing that the Ukrainian military was a huge military. I mean, we're talking 260,000 active duty forces that were trained to NATO standards and equipped to NATO standards and led by officers who had been to all the Western military academies. The majority of Ukrainian military battalions were considered interoperable with NATO, meaning you could plug them out, plug them into a NATO exercise, and they would function as part of the NATO team. So these are very competent people. I don't ever want to create, as opposed to, for instance, the Iraqi military, which had competent officers, but the military had been destroyed in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm, and then for over a decade denied the ability to reconstitute itself because of economic sanctions. And then when we rolled in 2003, we're literally dealing with a decrepit military force that had nothing there, nothing to offer, nothing to resist. The Ukrainians are the exact opposite of this, highly trained. So this was never going to be an easy task. Anybody who says Putin was expecting just to roll over these guys and take the country in 3 days literally doesn't know what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Russia knew they were going to be in for a fight. They were hoping that they would be able to talk their way through some of the initial parts, to get the pro-Russian community to come over, to get certain Ukrainian units to defect in place, to disarm. That didn't happen. So there's a fight. But this fight has never been about, a hot knife through butter. This fight is about two giant grinding stones grinding each other down. It's going to be bloody. It's going to be horrible, and it's going to be painful for everybody involved. This was never going to be easy, but the outcome was inevitable because at the end of the day, war isn't just about throwing bodies into the blender. War is about making sure you got the fuel, you got the ammo, you got the logistics. And the Russians have the fuel. Their tanks are still rolling. Guess whose tanks can't roll much anymore? The Ukrainians, because there ain't no gas to go in the tank. Guess whose artillery is starting to reduce the rate of fire? The Ukrainians, because there's no more ammo. All the dumps have been blown up. Resupply lines have been cut. And the Ukrainians right now, they can't coordinate large maneuvering forces, so they've broken down into smaller battalion-sized elements that are being ground down even more efficiently by the Russians. So we're reaching a culminating point where the effectiveness of the Ukrainian resistance is going to collapse dramatically. Now, here's where Mariupol comes into importance. The Ukrainian government knows this. They know that they are literally running on fumes. Surrounding Mariupol are a number of Russia's top fighting formations. If Mariupol falls, Russia will be able to release maybe 20, 30,000 troops back onto the main battlefield where their presence will overwhelm the Ukrainians and cause a situation that's rapidly deteriorating to deteriorate even faster. So the longer the Ukrainians can hold on to Mariupol, the better chance they have in their mind of consolidating whatever remains of the Ukrainian army into some sort of effective defensive line. And so it's a race against time. While the Ukrainians are working to create a new defensive line, the Russians are trying to create this pincer movement, but meanwhile, Mariupol is tying down a significant number of Russian troops. So if Mariupol surrenders, those troops are released, and Russia has a much easier time. The Ukrainian government is making one of those very, very difficult decisions. They're going to sacrifice a large number of their troops because the guys who stay there are going to die, and they're willing to sacrifice thousands of civilians who are going to get killed in the fighting, in between, to buy time for the rest of the Ukrainian military to attempt. And I don't even think they're going to be able to succeed in this, but to give them a fighting chance of attempting to reconstitute a meaningful defensive line that can continue to hold the Russians back and grind the Russians down, because that's the Ukrainian objective, is to make this invasion too painful for Russia to sustain.
I know, but
They haven't achieved that yet, but they could if the Russians are unable to maintain their dominance on the battlefield. I think the Russians have maintained the dominance. I think the collapse of the Ukrainian military is inevitable, but I have to tell you, if I were the Ukrainian leadership, from a military perspective, I'd be making the same decision.
really,
You will not surrender. You will fight to the last man, and you will hold every Russian down. That's a hard military decision, but it has to be made.
but doesn't that just get their military smashed? And you've already said yourself that many of the other ones, they've lost the capability of having these kind of large-scale actions. I mean, their military is basically split up into multiple cauldrons all throughout Ukraine, especially from the standpoint of the West, East. So why is it a good idea to have the military basically collapse in this way? I mean, that just seems to, it just seems that you're losing your guys.
Well, I come from I'm a Marine. We don't surrender, ever.
Yeah. And my other question, Scott, too, is yesterday you have Russia, shooting off this hypersonic missile. You're saying that Russia right now is in the strong spot. Why would they fire off a missile, do you think?
Okay. Tomorrow there's going to be a meeting, Thursday, I think it's tomorrow, a meeting in Brussels of NATO leadership.
Right.
And Hungary's already warned. The Hungarian prime minister has come out and said there's some really dangerous ideas on the table. Really dangerous ideas. And I've already written about this. I call it the Article 4 trap.
And when you say dangerous ideas, elaborate. Is this the chemical warfare that they're talking about? Like, what is it?
Well, it's more dangerous. First of all, chemical warfare. This is the stupidity of America, where we got caught out with a biological program that we can't explain. So we deflect by creating a threat that doesn't exist. There is no chemical weapons threat. No one's going to use chemical weapons. It's just stupid to talk about it. What is dangerous, though, is you've got 10, 12 million refugees headed towards the Polish border, towards the Romanian border. And right now, Poland is freaking out. So Poland is proposing to insert peacekeeping troops into Western Ukraine to keep the refugees there, to secure space, etc. And Hungary has said, we ain't buying into this nonsense. And neither will Bulgaria, neither will the Czech Republic, neither will a whole bunch of NATO members, which means now Poland will operate as an independent entity backed by probably Great Britain, probably the United States, probably some EU members who aren't NATO members, such as Sweden. And
I mean, don't we have troops in Poland right now, too, where they were helping with exercises?
We have troops in Poland. I don't believe American troops will be on the ground in Poland, but we have American troops in Poland as a capability to respond if the Polish troops in Ukraine come on threat. So now you have this situation where NATO is thinking crazy thoughts. Crazy thoughts. And so the Russians are saying, let me give you a crazy thought. It's called the Kinzhal. It's a missile you'll never be able to stop. Here, we'll fire one. Watch. Oh, geez, you guys track that a little bit? See how fast it goes? See how it maneuvers near the end? And it hits exactly where it's supposed to hit? Yeah, hey, Poland, every single site of importance to you will be hit by a Kinzhal. Germany, you want to play ball? Imagine Berlin getting hit by this, because we're not playing games.
This is their way of basically getting across, don't mess with us. Don't get involved in this conflict.
And Putin has said anybody that gets involved in this, you will immediately be seen as an aggressor.
Yeah.
You hear what the Russians said yesterday when they talked about the Kinzhal. They said, oh, by the way, it's supposed to be used as a nuclear weapon. We're just using a conventional warhead.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. Yeah, this is dark.
You know, we have some time left, and I want to make sure we get to Iraq with you because you had a very integral part in all of it. You know, and one of the things we were saying before we tossed to you was, you know, the American people are a little bit wiser this time around. They're seeing what's happening with Ukraine. They're seeing with Russia, as well as a lot of these other countries. And it feels like kind of the American people are like, we want to stay out of it. Biden and NATO, they keep ramping it up. But kind of, you know, this is the 19th anniversary of the Iraq invasion. You're, again, as an integral part of it,
18.
What does it mean to you? 18. Math was never my strong suit. But 18th anniversary, what does it mean to you looking back?
Well, I mean, you know, first of all, it's a deeply personal experience. I had made a decision. It was a difficult decision to speak out against my government, against policies that I thought were wrong, were based on a lie. And in doing so, you know, I didn't. Yeah, I'm not someone who believes in futile gestures. I don't do anti-war demonstrations because I just view it as a futile gesture. If you can't tell me how we're going to get from A to Z with a final objective that's going to meaningfully impact something, I don't want to participate because I just don't believe in gestures. I put it all on the line. I traveled to Iraq. I met with the Iraqi parliament. I met with the senior Iraqi leadership, imploring them to allow weapons inspectors back in because at the time, the U.S. was saying the lack of inspectors meant that we had to assume the worst. And I told the Iraqi leadership from Saddam on down that if you don't let the inspectors back in without any preconditions, the United States is going to take you off the face of the earth. And I told this to them in September of 2002, and they accepted what I said. I was attacked. I was smeared. I was reviled as a traitor. But I put it all on the line to try and stop a war that didn't need to be fought. And I came so damn close. The Iraqis allowed the inspectors back in. But what I didn't realize, and I should have because I watched it for 10, is my government is a lying sack of cow manure. They didn't care about inspectors going back in. The inspectors were an inconvenience to them. They had already made their mind up there was going to be a war. It didn't matter if the inspectors disproved pages of American allegations. Every single intelligence-based allegation the United States documented in October of 2002 was disproved by the inspectors by December 2002, but that wasn't good enough. We went to war. So I took that pretty hard because I put it all on the line in an effort to achieve an objective, and it didn't happen.
Scott, can you give me a contrast we have about 3 minutes left, between the way the war has been waged or was waged in Iraq versus the war that's being waged in Ukraine currently?
Simplistically, what we're going to say is both wars are justified as preemptive. The United States justified going to Iraq as a war of preemption, that we were preempting an Iraqi aggression. There was no Iraqi aggression. We made it up. The Russians have constructed a similar case of preemption, but their case has much more validity. It's grounded in the expansion of NATO. It's grounded in NATO's repeated use of Article 4 Remember that number. I'm telling you, Article 4 to justify illegal wars of aggression against Libya, Serbia, Afghanistan, and it's grounded in NATO training Ukraine to carry out unconventional warfare attacks into Russia, into Donbass, into Ukraine. So the Russians had every right to say, we feel that this is a potential attack against us. We're preempting it. So I think that Russia has a much stronger legal foundation. I know this is going to be very controversial to some people, but I've studied it, and I'm telling you, the Russians are on solid ground in justifying their actions under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, where the United States didn't even try to justify under Article 51. The United States carried out an illegal war of aggression. Russia's carrying out a very difficult but lawful war of necessity.
And for those that don't know, the Article 4, it states here, it can be triggered when one or more NATO members deem the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of any of the member states to be threatened. So you're saying with Poland going in as peacekeepers to help those refugees into Poland, that, God forbid, Russia decides to, hey, this is an act of aggression, that would be the point where NATO would say, here we go. World War III kickstarts.
NATO's already said it. I mean, Poland and the 3 Baltic states have already convened Article 4 consultations. Those will extend in this meeting tomorrow. And but what I'm saying is that on Article 4, I think the majority of the NATO countries are going to shut it down. And then what's going to happen is that Poland's going to act unilaterally, backed by other nations. So it will be a non-NATO peacekeeping mission. But then when Russia responds, NATO will respond as an alliance.
Response. Scott, thank you for this.
Wow,
Always appreciate your analysis on this. The voice you guys were listening to is Scott Ritter. He's a former UN weapons inspector and weapons of mass destruction whistleblower. You can follow Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. You guys are listening to Fault Lines, Thomas, Franzak. Back in a moment.